I'm Greg Schaefer, and I'm now at Georgetown University Law Center, and I'll chair this panel on the impact of Trump's election on the war in Ukraine. President Trump has been in office for just short of 3 months. This panel builds from what ASIL's done with respect to Ukraine, including the trip that we took there in December of 2023 on the 75th anniversary of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, and the follow-up symposium we organized with Just Security, and the book that we're working on with our Ukrainian colleagues at the Ukrainian Association of International Law. Obviously, much has taken place since that trip, including since the start of the year. But given the power of the United States, militarily, financially, a change in administration in this country has immense implications, not only for people in this country, but also for people around the world. So this panel is going to address the ways in which the election and the return to power of President Trump has impacted the war in Ukraine, the potential and nature of a ceasefire and broader peace, the implications for Ukraine and its sovereignty, Russian accountability for its war of aggression, and Ukrainian and international law and institutions more generally. The United States, as you know, has been responsible for the most important arms shipments to support Ukraine's defense, as well as its financial aid. The United States has been central for NATO policy toward the war, the coordination of sanctions against Russia, discussions over what to do about the frozen assets of Russia. This panel will explore a series of questions regarding the war, prospects for peace, for ending it, the implications for Ukraine and international law. We start with a short trailer of the documentary that was produced when ASIL went to Ukraine to set the stage for the panel discussion. The full, finally edited film will be shown on Thursday, April 17th at 10:30 a.m. in Columbia Rooms 3 and 4. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to do so. It's been very well received internationally. In fact, it won the Best Documentary, Short Documentary Prize at the Berlin Film Festival. And a short description of the film is you can also find in your app. So with that, we're going to see just a 2-minute trailer of the film, and then we'll turn to the panel where we are now today.
If you care about freedom, and you care about democracy, and you care about human rights, then you have to care about what's happening in Ukraine. If Ukraine loses on the Eastern Front, we all lose. And the world's completely transformed, and that's just not acceptable.
The attack on Ukraine is an attack on the international legal order itself, which is why we're here to stand tall for the rule of law.
This system is coming to get Vladimir Putin. You don't just invade a country, show aggression, and use atrocities and get away with it.
We must build our victory together. Only victory. Never give up.
Everyone knows that Russia has committed aggression, but it must be proven before the court of law.
It's easy to talk about the law of armed conflict without really getting into the soldiers on the ground. Seeing it up close is a reminder that it's real.
I chose to come to Lviv to show solidarity, to talk about the future and how we can build a better future together to help Ukraine find its lawful place in the world.
Ukraine is defending the most American value there is, which is a government built for its citizens, by its citizens, to keep a nation safe and prosperous. That is what Ukraine is fighting for.
Great. So that was in December 2023. And this panel is going to address where we are now. I'm pleased to introduce our 4 panelists. Harold Hanju Koh, who is Sterling Professor of International Law and former Dean of Yale Law School, served as U.S. State Department Legal Advisor and Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He has been advising Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs on international law matters since 2015. Meg de Guzman is Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Institute for International Law and Public Policy at Temple University Beasley School of Law. She also serves as a judge of the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals, where she currently sits on the trial chamber in the prosecutor versus Felician Kabuga. Michael Kelly's got held up at a Detroit airport, so he can't be with us. And so I'm really pleased for Patrick Pearsall to step in at the last moment. Patrick directs the International Reparations and International Law Project at Columbia Law School. He teaches on the subject and has co-edited a book on international claims commissions, and he is appointed by President Zelensky on a task force to think through civil reparations. And Svetlana Starosvit, who has been with us at ASOL's International Law Fellow for the Lviv Initiative. She's a recent graduate of Harvard Law School's SJD program. She previously worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, counseling on legal strategies for holding Russia accountable before international courts in the aftermath of its aggression going back to 2014. She also served in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, working on issues of international human rights and humanitarian law. All of our panelists were with us in Lviv for the joint symposium between ASOL and the Ukrainian Association of International Law. So I'm going to start with a series of questions for Harold. Harold, in your view, how have the first 3 months of Trump's presidency affected the following: the conduct of the war in Ukraine and the prospects for peace there, the role of the United States and NATO to maintain peace on the European continent, and the broader international legal order as we know it, including the roles of international law and international institutions created after World War II and the end of the Cold War. How does the way in which a ceasefire takes place and the fighting ultimately ceases through some sort of deal augur for peace in Ukraine and Europe and for the broader international legal order?
Sorry, Greg, has it only been 3 months? I think the short answer is that Trump has changed our calculations as international lawyers who care about standing tall for the rule of law in Ukraine, but it has not changed our commitments. And I don't think we should assume that anything that we hope to see emerge in Ukraine should change because of Trump's appearance. So remember, Trump had a 24-hour plan. It's past 24 hours now. It was a very crude idea. I think he thought that they would do some sort of freeze, that the U.S. would threaten to cut off aid, and that Zelensky would just knuckle under, that the Ukrainians would withdraw from the Kursk offensive. He would talk to the North Koreans and they'd get out. And he probably thought that from all of that, he'd win the Nobel Peace Prize or something else like that. That did not happen. On the war front, obviously, there have been some horrific recent developments, the Palm Sunday strikes in Sumy, where Trump actually said that he considered these to be horrible. His special envoy said that it crossed any line of decency. And what's also pretty clear is that even though Trump allocates the blame for not getting to peace among Zelensky, Putin, and Biden, in fact, they're not really getting very far with the ceasefire talks. And so the latest reports are that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is losing patience, that the Russians simply want to talk about talks, and so that the only idea they have is a ceasefire or peace at any cost. Meanwhile, and I think this is very important, one of the very low moments of my life as an international lawyer was the 3rd anniversary when we had in swift succession the United States voting at the UN against the idea of the Russian aggression, Trump and Vance bullying Zelensky, President Zelensky, in the Oval Office to try to get him to sign a minerals deal. And then shortly after that, Pete Hegseth threatening to pause intel sharing, arms shipments, and cyber support. But what's actually happened since then is the very next day, President Zelensky went to Europe, and an alternative plan emerged, not peace at any price, but peace with certain guarantees, a durable peace, and really a peace process led by the Europeans. And that's a real plan. It's a ceasefire followed by truce, followed by a pact, followed by the introduction of a European peacekeeping force, followed by a plan toward reconstruction, reparations, compensation, and accountability. And I think the challenge right now is to morph Trump's amorphous plan into the European plan and persuade him that this was his idea. Essentially, it's a kind of Edinburgh Festival approach to international law. He thinks what he's doing is the main show, but in fact, it may well turn out to be the fringe.
Okay, thanks, Harold. Many maintain it's something that you just challenged in terms of your statement, that the end game of the war has really been playing out between Moscow and the United States alone, leaving out Ukraine, leaving out our European allies. What are the implications for current negotiating procedures and dynamics? Are we witnessing with Ukraine a sort of so-called transactional America First approach to the world? How do you view Europe's responses to date and their prospects and the implications for Ukraine?
Well, as we all see watching Trump, he has a very short attention span. And in recent weeks, his attention has been devoted to disrupting the world economic order, so he has had less time to disrupt the world political order. He certainly made a series of threatening statements about using force in Panama, possibly against Greenland, committing U.S. troops involuntarily in Gaza. All of these things are starting to fade away as the Europeans and those actually invested in the region assert themselves. But I think the three key ideas that we as international lawyers can promote, and I think this is what's in this panel, is first, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Ukraine has to be at the table. The idea that the U.S. and Moscow are going to resolve this, and the people whose independence and sustainable future is at stake are not going to participate in the negotiations with those who have been providing them the bulk of their support is ludicrous. Second, that there should be no lift of sanctions and unfreezing without accountability, civil and criminal. And the truth of it is that most of the frozen assets are held by Europeans, not by the United States. And they have indicated no intention to lift those sanctions anytime soon. And they've already started the flow of $51 billion of interest on their frozen assets to Ukraine to support civilian reconstruction. And the third is continuing the path of Ukraine into NATO. Russia has not fired a shot inside of NATO. Putin's security guarantees in any negotiations are worthless, as we all know. The only thing that's going to provide those security guarantees is for Ukraine to be inside of NATO. Now, interestingly, the Biden administration left things on with what they called the 4 M's: money, munitions, mobilization, and momentum. And the truth is, they gave a lot of munitions. The Ukrainians have been fighting with them, and therefore they haven't stopped fighting. The money, a big chunk of it flowed. Trump has tried to pause it. That's probably unconstitutional and illegal under the Empowerment Control Act. I think a fair amount of that money is going to get there anyway. The military manpower is obviously still fighting. And the momentum is now being sustained by a different group of people, led by Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Merz, Mark Rutte. And I think, again, they should be supported by global civil society, including the American Society of International Law.
Great. Thank you, Harold. Turning to accountability, Meg, how do you view the shift in administration in terms of the prospects for holding Russia and Russians accountable for Russia's aggression, its war crimes, and the immense damages that it's inflicted in Ukraine? And given the developments that we're witnessing in the United States today, do you believe that Russia and its leadership will ever face accountability, and in particular, criminal accountability, for the violence wrought on Ukraine, a neighboring state, in violation of the central norms of the UN Charter?
Yeah. Thank you, Greg, and thanks to the organizers for putting the panel together. I'm, of course, speaking in my individual capacity, not as a judge of the residual mechanism. And I want to start by saying that I had the immense privilege, as we all did, of joining the delegation to Lviv, and one of the things that was very clear from that trip, as well as from a subsequent trip that I took to Poland to assist in some trainings of local prosecutors, and judges involving crimes related to the environment last fall, what I came away with was a very strong sense of the capacity of the national system to effectuate accountability for these crimes. And so I said to Svetlana, I'm very glad that Svetlana is on the panel, and I said to her to please chime in if I omit anything, but I think that's where I wanted to start. And I guess I follow a bit on what Harold was saying in terms of some degree of optimism that there is going to continue to be, or that I have a continued significant hope for accountability, in particular because of the strength of the domestic system, which in an incredibly short time after the full-scale invasion has been built up to have this capacity to now have investigations open into about 150,000 cases of war crimes, and to be, building those cases. And so in terms of the effect of the Trump administration, there has been some withdrawal of support and funding, certainly from those efforts. Part of that has been through the withdrawal of support from the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, of which the US was a significant funder. And so I don't want to minimize the negative effect of millions of dollars being frozen. At the same time, it is very clear that the commitment and expertise of the Ukrainian judicial system, the Ukrainian prosecutors, remains incredibly strong, and the capacity is there. I'll just also touch a little bit on some other mechanisms. The ICC, of course, has opened a number of investigations and has 6 arrest warrants pending, including against Putin. And the US change in administration has meant that there is now, instead of some degree of support for the ICC in those efforts, which we had seen under the Biden administration, active fighting against the court. In particular, as I'm sure most, if not all in the audience know, there have been sanctions leveled against the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, and the language there is that the sanctions are against Karim Khan, as well as any foreign person or organization determined to have directly engaged in any effort by the ICC to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute protected persons, defined as US nationals or our allies who have not consented to the ICC's jurisdiction. So we're now in a posture of not only not supporting the ICC efforts in regard to accountability for war crimes in Ukraine, but actively fighting against. Now, I think it's early to say what the effects will be. There were, of course, sanctions in the first Trump administration that were overturned by the Biden administration, and they created substantial difficulties for the ICC in its operations. This time, the ICC has prepared, so I think that the effects are mitigated to some extent by that preparation. There is also a special tribunal for the crime of aggression that is being set up under the auspices of the Council of Europe. And just recently, 3 documents were adopted by 38 states, including Ukraine, Council of Europe, the EU, but also states in other parts of the world. There's broad support for these documents, a draft statute for a special tribunal, an agreement that is going to be an international treaty that's going to establish how the tribunal is set up and managed and the resources that it obtains, as well as a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe. And this is a really major development that has happened, while the administration was actively, fighting against international law and accountability efforts. So centered in Europe, but under the jurisdiction or the delegated jurisdiction of Ukraine. This court is not going to, looks like, these documents are not yet public, so others may know more about the details than I do, but it looks like it will not engage in absentia trials, and there will be issues related to immunities for the Troika for the crime of aggression, so there are limits to what it will be able to do, but I think it's important to emphasize that there is continued very strong support for accountability, including for the crime of aggression, which is extremely important to many people in Ukraine. And then lastly, I'll just mention efforts by third-party states acting under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which have been ramping up. Countries in Europe in particular, France and Germany among others, are using universal jurisdiction more, including in regards to crimes committed in Ukraine, than ever before. So I anticipate that trend will continue and expand. And so there are multiple fronts in which there are possibilities for accountability to continue, despite the fact that there were many fronts on which the Ambassador van Schaack and her office, the State Department, various offices in the U.S. government were engaged in supporting accountability efforts, and that support is now gone. So despite that, I think there is room for optimism that accountability will continue, efforts at accountability will continue to progress.
Great, thank you. Has Europe stepped up financially in terms of to support where the United States has stepped away?
To some degree, I think so. That the U.S. financial resources are very important, and I don't think we should underestimate the effect of that. The groups like the group at Georgetown that were involved in providing expertise and are no longer, or through USAID that are no longer able to do that, is a significant loss, I think. But yes, I think Europe has stepped up. I think even maybe as important as the financial ways that Europe has stepped up, it's stepped up in terms of reinforcing its commitment and saying, even sort of, we are more committed than we sort of want to express our commitment even more strongly than we did before, in light of the fact that the U.S. is no longer committed and actively in some ways fighting against. So, for example, in regard to the ICC, many states have expressed their continued support for the ICC very strongly in the face of and their disapproval, their strong condemnation even of the U.S. sanctions, so that there is a way in which the political support has been ramped up, as well as the economic support in Europe and other parts of the world as well.
Great, thank you. Patrick, moving to accountability for the civil damages that Russia's caused, how has international law responded to the necessity to repair an international wrongful act? What's the core responsibility of states? What's the status of the current work on accountability, civil accountability? And are these mechanisms, if they're properly stood up, sufficient to accomplish this obligation of state responsibility? If not, what more needs to be done?
Thanks, Greg. And having stepped onto this panel about an hour ago, perhaps my remarks will come across as a little bit naive, but I wanted to kind of amplify Meg's optimism, and that we do have a really good story to tell on the progress of international law on repairing the international wrong, at least on the civil compensation side, right? So Oscar Schachter once wrote in a 1977 article about the invisible college of international law. He posited that international law was reasonably diffuse and that those who practiced international law were kind of an invisible college that was all moving in a certain kind of direction. Well, we're in a much different place than we were in 1977, and the Ukrainian government, in the infancy of the war, just within a matter of a few weeks, activated that invisible college and posed the question to international lawyers, many in this room, how will Russia be held accountable for the economic harms that it's visiting upon Ukraine? And the answer was first kind of found in the ILC articles, right? Where an international wrong has been committed, that wrong must be repaired, right? That's Article 31, and then repaired perhaps if restitution and other mechanisms are not available through compensation. That's Article 34. So the starting point of this good news story is international law. So we can at least, in this world of a lot of noise, take a breath and feel comfort that international law had an answer, right? Now the question is how to operationalize that answer. And we called together a bunch of scholars and started thinking through what mechanism is the best mechanism to accomplish this requirement under international law. And we landed on a compensation commission, and that's a mechanism that is not unique to this moment, right? This is a mechanism that is quite ancient in reality. Homer first talks about compensation for war damage, and he puts this image on Achilles' shield. On Achilles' shield, right? The greatest warrior in, at that point, the ancient world, but perhaps ever, right? Is shielded by international law, by the reparations. And Grotius picked up on that, obviously, and Grotius said, you know, in order to win the future security, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not going to quote Grotius, but in order to win future security of the combatants, reparation is due for the harm, right? He understood that in order to win the peace, you have to repair. So the Jay Treaty picked this up in mixed claims commissions between the United States and the UK, and so on and so on. And there's been dozens and dozens of examples where states have ended their dispute with a reparations moment. Now, we're at a moment now where at least one combatant is unwilling to participate in that process. All of the processes that I've just described had two willing parties, right? Think about the UNCC and Iraq's commitment to repair Kuwait. Here we're in a kind of a unique world of a recalcitrant party and a party that is being injured even at this exact second that I'm speaking, right? So what do? We decided to come up to put this question, or to put a resolution forward to the UN General Assembly to cloak this endeavor in additional international legitimacy. That was reasonably controversial. I'm sure there's many different views in this room as to whether that was a good idea. The resolution passed. 94 states voted in favor of a UN General Assembly resolution, bypassing the Security Council, calling for a damages registry to be established to register the damage that was occurring on a daily basis in Ukraine. So it took as its mooring post that an international wrong was being committed, right? That's clear. And made the syllogism that that wrong needed to be repaired through a damages registry and ultimately a claims commission. And that's underway now. The damages registry has stood up. It sits in The Hague. I encourage you all to visit the Secretariat. There are dozens, literally dozens of lawyers working on this. It has a website. It's called RD4U something, which is Registry of Damage for Ukraine, not a Star Wars character. And they are registering claims now. And there have been thousands of claims registered. Now, what that will eventually turn into, how it will be adjudicated, where the funding will come from, these are open questions. But these are questions that are being picked up right now by 43 to 45, depending on which way you count, member states who are working on a multilateral instrument that will establish tricky questions about jurisdiction, tricky questions about funding, rules of procedure. These are cutting-edge issues. There are no easy answers here, but they're moving forward. They're moving forward with a multilateral instrument. So the good news story here is we have a mechanism, we have an international thing that is at least quantifying the trillions of dollars in costs and harm that has occurred. In many ways, those harms are immeasurable, but it is a tool, an international tool, that at least vindicates that basic principle of international law that reparations are due. Now, the open questions, which is the purpose of the panel, is what role the United States will now play, right? The United States played a very significant role in moving this forward in the previous administration. What this administration will do is really an open question. We haven't seen yet the kinds of things that Meg and Harold talked about in this space. And the question of how it will be funded, Harold rightfully noted that the majority of the monies that are frozen and blocked sit in Brussels, not in the United States. So in many ways, this is a European question. The RD4U sits in the Council of Europe under the auspices of Europe. But the question of kind of how Ukraine will be compensated, how this money will be used in any ceasefire or ultimately durable peace agreement are all open questions. And what role the United States will play with regard to that mechanism is open as well. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Patrick. Svetlana, let's turn to you. So what's the view from Ukraine of the political shift in the United States and its implications for the country? Our other panelists have listed many impacts of the return of power of the Trump administration on the war, on peace, on Russian accountability. But how do Ukrainians feel about these questions? Are they unified? Are there divisions in their reactions? And Ukrainians clearly are such a resilient people, considering everything that they have gone through, as we discovered when we were there. But is there a limit to that resilience when support from the United States is called into question and it begins to fade?
Thank you, Greg. It's very great to reconvene with this small group. And I would like to start by extending warm greetings from Ukraine, from Kiev, from Lviv, from Olga Butkevich, the president of the Ukrainian Association of International Law, the dear friend of ASIL, who helped ASIL to convene the summit, Center for the Rule of Law, which happened almost 2 years ago. They send their warm greetings, and they say that it's time to reconvene again. There's lots of things to discuss. Coming back to your question, Greg, Ukraine is tired, for sure, but its spirit is not broken. The spirit, the language of unbroken, which you experienced almost 2 years ago, it's still there. And I think that there is a sense of unity. Also, the community is united and people are united. And there is a reason for this. The Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian society remains resilient because it knows what it's fighting for. It's fighting for its survival, and it's fighting for its right to remain an independent sovereign nation. And it's also about the defense of basic democratic values. And I know that it has been the framing of Ukraine's resistance as a fight for democracy has been extensively criticized, but I think that it has to be acknowledged. We can disagree, of course, on many things, what democracy can mean and what values it has to represent, but what has to be acknowledged is that Ukraine doesn't want to live in a society which is in constant fear of government punishment for its political activism. It's as very basic as this is, and I think that this is universal. If this is not universal, it should be. And for Ukraine, which is a very politically active society in overall, the fading support is unfortunate, but my overall sense is that the overall attitude is pragmatic. Our path to independence and freedom has never been straightforward. It's too easy to forget these days after all this atrocities that the war started in 2014, and back then there were lots of uncertainties, and Russia wanted to make many people's republics in Ukraine's regions almost all over the country. And they didn't achieve this because the people resisted. There was no military support, and the position was different. There was no reaction which Ukraine hoped for, but nevertheless, again, back then we knew what we were standing against, and we resisted consolidation of power inside the country 2 times at least, and it's all just unfair that an external power can still come and say, no, this is the way you should organize things politically and ideologically in your country. So there should be some elementary justice, I think. And in 2022, again, the Ukrainian people had made a choice to resist rather than to surrender. And it was not a very easy choice to make. They did not know how the international world would react. And many newspapers said that Kyiv will fall in 72 hours. With this background in mind, the Ukrainian people nevertheless resisted. That said, help is critical because Russia really doubled down on its strategic goal to just make Ukraine knuckle under. And as long as Russia keeps advancing, military aid is absolutely critical. And Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. Every time the world stands idly by, the Ukrainian people fight for its very survival, Russia feels empowered to continue. Every act of support matters. Economic support, weapons, diplomatic pressure, academic discussions, all this reinforces Ukraine's defense. Every act of inaction reinforces Russia. My sense is that the overall concern, the emerged concern after Trump stepped into power, is the return to familiar points of Kremlin's narrative, portraying Ukraine resilience as futile and leading to some sort of conclusion that the war must end. Nobody wants to end this war more than Ukrainians do, and the war must end. But it must end because Russia's aggression must end, not because Ukraine has to finally realize that it faces what it seems like an insurmountable adversary it cannot defeat. We know that we face a way more powerful opponent, but it's certainly not unstoppable, and it certainly doesn't mean that the only option we have, well, surrender, because we also think that there should be a rule of law in world affairs. And the reality is that Russia failed to break Ukraine. Russia failed to defeat Ukraine. And now it counts on this international apathy as part of a strategy. For this reason, I think it's very important to keep attention on what's going on in Ukraine, to have a Ukraine-centric discussion about peace and various prospects. It's a very long-term, of course, process, but it should start just with rejection of Russia's narratives. You can agree or disagree with Ukraine's perspective, but the main focus should be how to enable Ukraine to withstand and roll back Russia's aggression, not how to force Ukraine into any kind of concessions, which will not end the war anyway. So what Ukraine is really tired of, and this is what I would like to end my short remarks with, they are very tired that with the persistent threat from Russia, and the war should end and should not begin again. So that's one of the key messages I keep hearing from my colleagues, from my relatives, from everywhere, because it's been a long war. 11 years, although the last, of course, 3 years were absolutely brutal. But what it means that many people, and I think also it's sometimes very hard to capture this, for thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who lost everything 11 years ago, and then they had to lose everything again 3 years ago. So there are many people who lost their homes twice, who lost their jobs, who lost their relatives. It's so just the idea that this will happen again, like the question is how many times do people have to rebuild their life over and over and over again? So there should be a strategic discussion how to make this happen, because Russia is on our borders. We are absolutely conscious of that. But the situation is that Ukraine is gone for Russia. It is gone mentally, ideologically, politically, in every way possible, it is gone. And Russia should not just be allowed to use threat to change its will and to affect its will to resist.
Great, thank you. Any other panelists want to step in before I open it up for the floor for questions? Any responses? Yeah, Harold?
Just on a grand scale, I think when the inauguration was about to happen, there was a lot of speculation that there would be a sort of great power alliance to destroy international law, that you would have Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping all collaborating to actively destroy the institutions of international law, and that this meant doom for Ukraine. But already you're seeing tensions between Trump and Putin. After they refused to make any sort of agreement about the ceasefire, Trump said, "I'm very angry with Putin." You know, Xi Jinping has just imposed 84% counter tariffs against Trump. And Trump himself is engaging all over the American domestic landscape with very dubious claims of power and being sued. And there have been, well over 50 judicial orders declaring various actions of his illegal and unconstitutional. So the fact of the matter is that international law is much more resilient and much bigger than these individuals and can outlast them. They may try to withdraw from institutions and treaties, but they can't withdraw from customary international law. They can't withdraw from peremptory norms. And at the end of the day, naked aggression and war crimes don't become more tolerable because their abuse has been so prolonged, or because we have leaders who don't care about the rule of law. That's what the society is for. We care about it. And it's up to us to sustain it, even if we happen to have elected or unelected officials who don't.
Great. So I want to, people who have questions, please come, if you have them, up to the microphone. And try to keep your questions short and crisp, if you would. And identify yourself.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
Jennifer Trahan, NYU. So Meg mentioned the Council of Europe Tribunal and the potential of immunity for the Troika. So the audience may not know that the US fought for the position of immunity for the Troika. And the audience may be surprised that this happened under the Biden administration, and not the current administration. And the US also pressed for impunity of non-state parties in 2010 in Kampala. And it is that negotiating position that has exempted Putin, both before the ICC and now in the Council of Europe. So I guess my question is, how do you have accountability for a leadership crime when you exempt the top leaders? Now, I think Harold will say there are flaws in the definition, and I've read your article with Todd, and I know you weren't in those negotiations, but they were open to the US. I was at those negotiations, kind of wondering where the US was. This is, in my mind, really dangerous to give immunity to commit aggressive war, particularly in this geopolitical landscape. It impacts China, the threats countries make. I find it very dangerous. So I seek your thoughts.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Anybody?
I know that you are deeply engaged in this issue, Jennifer, as many others I'm sure in the room are. And I guess what I would say is two things. One, I know you've been actively involved in the discussions around amending the ICC statute that the Assembly of States Parties is meeting in July to discuss a proposed amendment in this regard. And so there may be movement in this area, and it may affect I think that we're going to have to leave it to the judges on the special tribunal to ultimately decide the scope of immunities, the applicability of immunities. But I think, again, just being of an optimistic nature, I think that there is movement in the direction of the crime of aggression being susceptible to adjudication. And then, of course, there's also the question of, these leaders are not likely to come before the tribunal until they're out of power anyway. And so at that point, they at least won't have personal immunity. So it's an issue that is still being developed in international law, and you and others are part of that development. But I think there, again, there's room for some optimism.
Great, it's very bright. I think we have a second question.
Hi, I'm Andrea Cayley. I'm the Executive Director of Arizona State University's DC campus, and I'm one of the founders and coordinators of the Atrocity Crime Advisory Group. I just wanted to clarify, rumors of its death are much exaggerated. After the stop work order in January, we are back at work. I just got back on Sunday from Ukraine. Another training group is going in May. So just to clarify that, there hasn't been a stop work for the partnership with the Prosecutor General's office. The concern now, though, mainly on the ground, is concerning the fact that Russia's main push for peace agreements includes amnesty for the war crimes. I would really love any opinions of how far amnesty could go. At the moment, the interpretation on the ground is that it would be focused on the prosecutors in Ukraine being unable to prosecute the crimes, and that it wouldn't limit the ICC or universal jurisdiction. But that amnesty issue is weighing on all of us and is a big part of why we're moving and trying to guarantee that all evidence that's been collected is safe and secure. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, for that news, at least to me. That's great to know. I think that there's not a lot to be said about the question of immunity beyond what you just said, which is that it's not going to affect the ICC or universal jurisdiction. I think that under customary international law and under the ICC statute, that is clear, but that depending on the agreement, it could certainly affect national courts, and that's an important aspect of the negotiations to try to be involved in, ensuring that the right outcome there.
Yeah, Harold.
Well, I think the question you raise just underscores 2 points that I made earlier. First, a lot of this turns on the president's legal authorities under domestic law to exercise certain kinds of authorities, which he's exercising or purporting to exercise. But the legality of that is yet to be determined, and one of that is his capacity to pause, suspend, or otherwise impound funds that were already committed. And that is actually subject to a statute, the Impoundment Control Act, which was passed in the 1970s after Nixon tried to do the exact same thing. And one reason why it's particularly relevant to Ukraine is that in 2019, when Trump was first talking to President Zelensky in the famous June 6th call, he basically threatened to withhold these funds, and the General Accounting Office said that this was illegal, and that his doing it was therefore the basis of a impeachment effort, and that conclusion has only been confirmed by a whole series of opinions and other kinds of rulings since. Now, this will have to go to the higher courts, but I think what's happening is this feeling that these impoundment efforts are going on and they're going to be challenged. But the other thing is that the Trump proposal is simply peace at any cost, or not even that, just ceasefire. There is no content beyond that. Whereas the European plan for what they call durable peace is peace with various kinds of guarantees. And it was during the end of the Bosnian conflict that the concept of no peace without justice was introduced into the discussions and was a central part of the diplomatic framework at Dayton, which has now held for well over a quarter of a century. It's hard to believe that the same countries that insisted on that there will suddenly abandon it here. But they were very much pushed to do so by NGOs, civil society, international law experts, and the like. So again, this is a place where the result is uncertain, but what we should do about it is pretty clear. We should keep insisting on no peace without justice.
Great. We have another question.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel. My name is Marion. I work with the Liechtenstein delegation in New York. I'm the legal advisor. Just perhaps one comment on what has been said regarding the special tribunal. So nothing has been yet adopted. There has been negotiations at the legal level indeed, and I know some of the negotiations are in the room. So I'm talking under their review as well. But now we are entering the political endorsement process that might or might not lead to an adoption of a text indeed. But we've just concluded the work at the legal level for now. And my question to you is picking up on the optimism in the room, which we very much support. We were talking about resilience of international law. And I think it's also a question towards international institutions, and particularly the United Nations. How can you show resilience in an area where, you're negotiating with a negotiator that doesn't abide by the normal rule of diplomacy? And that shows up in the Ukraine file, but that shows up also in other cases. So perhaps a question to the panelists in what do you think could be the legal avenue to reinforce the resilience of multilateralism in such a context?
Somebody? Yeah. Harold?
I think multilateral institutions have to prove their worth by their performance, particularly when the challenges for which they are created suddenly arise. And that is the challenge. Let's face it, the institutions of international criminal justice have not had an unvarnished track record. Even though they've been around for quite a while, the ICC still has a lot to prove about its capacities to act against the right people with regard to the right offenses. So now Duterte is there, that's an opportunity. And the question is, they have to win these kinds of support. The World Health Organization did okay, but didn't perform brilliantly in the COVID pandemic. They have a lot to do to earn the support. The United Nations has been damaged by its failure to have a reform mechanism that can address changes of leading powers and the veto system, and has been largely sidelined during the Ukraine crisis as a result. But at the end of the day, the multilateral organizations have to organize themselves as well as they can to produce particular kinds of outcomes that win them support. Those who have done so are, for example, UN High Commissioner on Refugees has done a brilliant job. I think that the environmental programs have done an outstanding job. World Food Program has done an outstanding job. So it's not a single report card for all of these things. And at the end of the day, institutions are expected to perform, and they are also held accountable for what they do.
And just to pick up on Harold's point, which cannot be amplified enough, I mean, just in thinking about the civil compensation work stream, a lot of the questions about whether international institutions will perform and the kind of quality of the resilience that Harold was talking about and what that quality looks like, what that resilience looks like in the future, are really questions of international law, right? It's questions that lawyers, several of you in this room, outside, sitting at The Hague, will have to decide. For example, on what basis, what jurisdictional basis does the Claims Commission seek to sit in judgment over the dispensation of monies to victims? That's an international law question. Will victims from Russia be permitted to make claims at this commission, which goes to the fundamental question of the commission's legitimacy, perhaps? These are international law questions that really need to be handled with nuance if the resilience that Harold talked about is going to persist.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, so please.
Hi, Diane Amen. I am a professor at the University of Georgia School of Law. For the last 2 years, I've served by appointment of the presidency of Ukraine on the Bring Back Kids UA Task Force, which is working on issues of return of the thousands of children who are alleged to have been taken from Ukraine and brought to Russian-held territory, where it's alleged that Russia is endeavoring to alter their identity and nationality in various ways and hindering all efforts of family members to get them back. I'm kind of shocked that that issue hasn't been raised here as a component of what the landscape is with regard to Ukraine-Russia today. I'd be very curious about where that fits in. Certainly there's an ICC arrest warrant against the president and his child rights commissioner for this, but we've already heard that amnesty appears to be on the table, and in any event, I suspect for the parents who've lost their children, the international criminal proceedings are perhaps not their first concern, and at the same time, money in the form of a claims commission is probably not their first concern either. So I'd be curious where that particular aspect of this war fits into the discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Diane.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I'm glad you brought that into the conversation, and your work on defining a kind of subset of crimes called child takings is, I think, important in this, an important development in this arena. And I think you're right that the most important aspect of that issue is not so much the accountability as the reparation or the ability of the children to reunite with their families. And then once that has been focused on and achieved to the greatest extent possible, then the next priority would be accountability for those crimes. But the idea that negotiations would sideline either of those goals or undermine either of those goals is indeed frightening.
Yeah, Harold?
I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning. Trump's election has changed our calculations, but it has not changed our commitments. And in Lviv, the panels that we attended at the conference that the ASIL and Greg put on discussed issues of creating legal architectures for stolen children, for sovereign immunity, for better systems of sanctions, for law and development, for inclusion of displaced persons and post-war migration, reconstruction of the system with a real civil construction plan, not just a minerals deal, and then what was called an accountability ecosystem, which included both civil and criminal accountability. All those needs still exist. And the fact that a very big player in the process is not particularly engaged on those issues doesn't mean that those commitments don't still exist. But another theme of the Lviv conference, and which I try to emphasize in my remarks there, was Putin's short game is force. Trump's short game is a ceasefire. But our long game and Ukraine's long game has to be law. And it will take a long time. And it will take sustained work and interest by everybody here over the course of many years. And as you say, Diane, you know, nobody's claiming that the Russian official who's now subject of the arrest warrant is a member of the Troika. She has no immunity. I don't know that people are putting on the table amnesty for her. And the content of the negotiations, which aren't really yet specified, and the measures of accountability that will be discussed in the negotiations are yet to be determined. There are no negotiations. They're talking about whether to have a ceasefire. Now, the Europeans, it very clearly is part of the discussion in what they would like to have as the negotiations. So that's why right now the most fundamental question is whether the European-led negotiations in which Ukraine is involved becomes the engine into which international civil society gives its support.
Great. Thank you. We're out of time. I'm just going to say a few words just to wrap us up, which is, thank you all for coming. I know many of you are doing really important work on these issues. It brings to mind sort of a saying which has meant a lot to me, is that even in the darkest of times, in the pessimism of the intellect, what's very important is the optimism of the will. And so just, at times people say, oh, we're moving back to, an interwar period which led to great catastrophes. But I think what has been pointed out by this panel is great resilience. What's different from the interwar period is that we do have the growth of international institutions, international law, to hold these acts accountable. And that's significant. There's an institutional stickiness that perseveres. I think that, it's important to see that history has a long arc. And the fact that President Duterte now is being held accountable, has been arrested, that's significant. And so this is going to be ongoing. We need to be thinking about this over time. And then for sociologists, it's very important, the concept of historical memory. Everything that everybody's doing right now is just very central to us to retain the historical memory of what has taken place in Ukraine, this war of aggression. And so whatever happens in the coming months, I think the documentation that's taking place, and for the people in this community here standing up for international law, that's what we do. Thank you for being part of this. If you'd like to see the film, the entire film regarding the trip to Ukraine, again, it's at Thursday at 10:30. I just want to thank our panelists very much.